wouldn't sit in the chair that wasn't shatnez tested. Anyway. So I think the shadow that you wanted to discuss the worms and fish, right?
I don't know anything.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Anything is
discuss and then go to meat and other stuff, sharing stuff like that. Whatever you want, whatever you want.
We're up to coming to Venezuela. What are we into?
So I got to give a shir in the morning in the Kalina Kail in Ramot. So it was a very. They told me they just finished Taruvas at the end of his mom. They wanted to have something to end off his mama, so they wanted a shir on Taruva Islamaisa. I explained to him, I said, there, Dafka, if I can, it's very hard to give on Taruva Islamaisa without going into other areas of halacha. I said, Taruvas is the crux, it's the melting point, so to speak, between Basa B'chala, between Machal Yaakov, between all sorts of different sugyas, between Achas Treifas, between all sorts of different things. You first have to have all these sizes, and then that's where all the shilas come out l'maisa. Discussed all sorts of different ideas and took questions and answers of. So fine, the Vard is like this. Kiyadua, there's a Shiloh. Kiyadua, in the last decade or so, this has been like a very hot Shiloh, so to speak, which is a Shiloh of worms in fish. Sometimes it dies down. I thought I hadn't heard about it for a while. Then Pitom, on one of these kashrus forums, before a kashrus, quote-unquote kashrus expert, somebody just put up again a whole new list of what dogim have the problem, what dogim don't have the problem. So, Kanira, it creeps up, no pun intended, every few years again, it becomes a very hot topic. Only problem is that the playing field sometimes changes. The original time that it came up, the Shai went to Moshe and to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And Dachu Zal Asaf. They didn't even let it get into the door. They said there's no Shiloh, it's mutter, and it kind of stopped the Shiloh. So people wrote contrastim on it. Why maybe it should be a problem, but basically it didn't get accepted into Ilm Psak, into Ilm Kashrus, because the G'dayli HaPaiskim, not getting into all sorts of others who also said that. But then, the next time around, the Moshe and Yankov weren't there to defend it even, and Moshe didn't write a tshuva because he didn't want to have the counter tshuvas at the time. Rabbi Krakowski said he spoke to him about it, and he didn't want to write a tshuva. He didn't want to legitimize the tzad even that there's a problem with it. So the shayla is like this. There's something in many of the common fish, from herring, kimat zicher, any herring will have it. Will have what's called anisakis inside. Get into anisakis, or the worms that they commonly find in the fish. So I'm not talking about in the carp. They find external worms that we know came in from outside, the regular prosta worms, regular worms like you find when bloodworms, and there's little bloodworms and things like that, which are different type of worm, and that's clear that it came from the outside, and that's usher. So that's in the carp, and that's where the carps kind of need to be checked for bugs. But I think now it's getting increasingly rarer that people buy carp if they aren't, except for Pesach, people make their own gefilte fish for Pesach, and so the Gadol, they're relying on whatever the hashkachas who are certifying are relying, and it's not as much of a personal shal. You're buying gefilte fish that might be made Israeli gefilte fish. The big difference between American style gefilte fish and Israeli style gefilte fish is American style gefilte fish is made from pike, from white fish, and Israeli style gefilte fish is made mostly from carp. Some of you have hybrids already that are made out of both types that combine some carp and some white fish, and they claim to be the best. Those are some of the ones that cost already immense amounts of money to purchase. And you don't even have the saving of a gefilte fish. Kitzar Maisa, the other fish that commonly have it it's a lot of the fish that people eat frequently. The other fish that commonly have it is salmon. And then all sorts of other fish might have it, might not have it, etc. Salmon, it also depends from where it comes. A lot of the salmon that people buy now, especially the cheaper salmon, those are pond salmon, which are farm grown, so to speak. They're not grown in salt water. They're grown in freshwater ponds that might mimic the salt water in various other ways. It's usually their color is less pink unless they had pigment dafka added to them, because some of that pink color comes from all the nutrients the vitamins and minerals that they get from the seawater, the salt water, the sunlight, etc., which they don't have as much of in these ponds, and therefore they're lacking some of that. The taste is also a bissel schwacher, and mevinim, the fine schmecker, very often will buy, wild Atlantic salmon, v'chule. They'll buy Alaskan salmon. Right? Anybody from Canada knows that Alaskan salmon, or even Scotian salmon, is considered high quality. That's Atlantic. But they buy Norwegian salmon, which is also usually saltwater salmon. So in saltwater salmon, again, depending from the exact region, they might have more or less of the Anisakis, but they'll very frequently have Anisakis. Sardines also have Anisakis. So many of the commonly consumed fish have these Anisakis worms. What?
Tuna also?
No. Now the Gemara, it's a Gemara Daf Samach Zayin on the Beis in Chulin. So the Gemara talks about these v'hilchas hakukinai asir ma'itayim minam noyim v'ayilei b'usay telam darni the bisra asir the chavari sharyon. So the ones that are inside the cavities are also the ones that are inside the flesh are mutter. Amar la Ravina li'imei, so Ravina said to his mother, Avli v'ano echol, cook it for me and I'm going to eat it. Amar le Rav Misharshia b'rei de Rav Achal le Ravina ma'ishnam, fine. So the Gemara goes into a whole series of questions of what's the difference between here and there, and different scenarios where we say that the teilam that are inside of something are mutter or aser, where they are, why they're mutter, aser, v'chulei. So the Gemara explains that minai gavli. Now, it's the ones that are found tachlis in the flesh of the fish, so to speak, already between the skin and the flesh. So we know that if they could be in the skin, between the skin and the flesh, they're not coming as external items, right? You don't see a hole in the skin where it came from. The skin looks totally intact, right? Kosher fish have scales. If it has scales, so it has like an armor. Right? In the olden days, when they would fight war and they would wear a knight in armor, right? The knight would put on the armor. The armor was basically artificial scales. It was metal scales similar to a mesh watch band, right? Where they kind of overlap over each other because that's one of the most protective. It gives flexibility with complete protection. So the fish generally, it should be pretty hard for anything of any size really to burrow through the skin. And so they somehow grew within the skin. We're going to talk about that in a second. What does it mean they grew within the skin? So Melo Medina de Gemara Kumtachais, that the worms that are in the flesh, mamish, between the skin and the flesh already, right? That those worms are definitely mutter. If we find them burrowing in from somewhere, whether it's from inside the stomach cavity into the flesh, or whether it's from outside, then they would be asir, because we say they came from somewhere else. They hatched and then they came into the fish. Now, over the years in the Paiskim, there's been discussions back and forth. Paiskim talking about the Rishonim and the Achronim. There's been discussions back and forth in terms of various different worms that were found at different points in time. If they are these worms that it's talking about, and melo it's mutter to consume fish that have such worms inside. Now, this din of minoi gavle isn't particular only to fish. We have this din by other items. The din is negea to bugs that they had commonly in the old-fashioned cheese. Nowadays, in our cheeses, most of the cheeses that we have, especially the kosher cheeses, won't have any of these issues of bugs in them. But then also the Gemara said that the bugs in the cheese are minoi gavli. They come from within the cheese. This is where they live, and in there the chiddush is even though they pop in and out, but hayais since they're popping out only to pop back in, and they're never landing on anything else, so to speak. So the pshat is this is where they always are, and mamelo they're mutter. Why? Because again, anybody was here in the earlier shur, and we talked about that the Torah asers sheretz haraymis, and the sheretz that's ahadama, sheretz karka. It asers sheretz hamayim and sheretz ha'if. It's things that fly in the air, things that are on the ground, and things that are in the water. If something isn't in any of those, so to speak, for whatever reason, which that's the other thing we can discuss. The other place where you have such a concept, so to speak, of minoi gavli, is if you have a fruit that, again, it has to be a fruit that had no holes, and that there's a likelihood that the bug hatched after after being picked. Because if it was on the tree that the bug hatched, or agam, that it lived in the fruit on the tree its whole entire life, it's still going to be aser. Why? Because the fruit is mechuber to the tree is mechuber lekarka. The melo has a din of a shayitz al adama. So it's aser not because it was anywhere else other than inside the fruit. It didn't come in from anywhere else. It was minoi gavle, so to speak. It was minoi gavle and something which has a din of karka. The melo, it's aser. But if it's something which moves around and isn't part of that bichlal, so now let's say you picked. This is very negeya to actually the shiloh, which I think we discussed at some point in raisins, bugs in raisins. The shach and the taz matter the bugs in the raisins. Why? Because they say that it's a svek sveika. In other words, you don't know that you're going to that there's a bug in any given raisin. So you don't have a chiyuv to be machapis after it. And even if you would find a bug, it's very likely that the bug only hatched. In other words, there might have been an egg there that was laid right before, but the bug only hatched after it was picked. Mela, once the grapes aren't on the vine anymore, it's not mechuber lekarka. Therefore, it's not sharitz al ho'adama. And the bugs inside such grapes or eventually raisins would therefore be mutter. So that's so there is such a svara in other areas as well. It's not unique to fish dafka. But now the shaila is that reoccurred already throughout the tkufas of the Rishayim and the Acharayim are the worms or bugs that we have nowadays or those days in the fish. Are they the same bugs that were being talked about by Chazal? So usually, it doesn't make a difference in, say, the nomenclature, right? The scientific name for the particular bug. It doesn't necessarily make a nafkamino if once upon a time it was white and now it's black, or vice versa. That's not the real chiluk, because the shaila is this. The Gemara tells us the sibas aheter is because minoi gavle was always in the flesh of the fish. So if you only find these types of insects between the flesh and the skin, so vice the chais, that it's definitely something which is minoi gavla and it's going to be mutter. And that less man de pali, I don't think there's anybody who's really raised any issues with worms that are there. The problem is as follows: that especially in sardines, they find that these anisakis, these worms, not only are in the flesh, but they're in the stomach cavity. Now they're in the stomach cavity, so this prompts a whole shiloh of what's going on here. Ulai, right? This is a speculation. Ulai, such a worm, is coming in from the outside. Right? The fish swallows it, and then somehow it burrows into the skin, and it's sometimes going to end up finding it between the flesh and the skin, but it burrowed in from inside the stomach, because you see that they're also in the stomach. So this is where the tzad le'esar starts from. Now, coupled with that is yet more reason to maybe aser, which is, what does that mean, minoi gavle? Minoi gavle, it grows out with the flesh miraculously turns into bugs. So they want to say, yes, that minoi gavle, it means that the flesh automatically turns into bugs. And they'll use a fancy term to describe that, called spontaneous generation. Meaning that somehow, something that yesh mi'ayin, right? Say that Rabbi Shem created man, he can create yesh mi'ayin, he can have flesh of the fish that turn into bugs, into worms. And mamelo, these we know aren't that. It's not something that, there are eggs, we can trace the eggs, we can find the eggs. We know that, B'chlal, nowadays you ask any scientist about spontaneous generation, he's going to look at you like you fell off the moon. There's no such thing. Everything has to come from somewhere, right? Philosophically, you can ask that question: what came first, the chicken or the chicken or the egg? But lamaisa, nowadays we know that without an egg, you're not going to have another chicken. So over here also, we know that without the eggs, without having a makim hatzmacha for it, it doesn't come about. There's no such thing as spontaneous generation. So let's leave those as the stadim la'asar. So Rabbi Krakowski Zechariah Levracha took a lot of offense by the last tzad of it. There's no such thing as spontaneous generation. And I said, that means that you're assuming Chazal made a tais. And what?
killing a kina on Shabbos?
Oh, killing a kina on Shabbos, it's the same thing. Minoi Gavle, that it comes from. So Rabbi Krakowski did not like the svara at all of saying that Chazal made a tais. He said, why should we assume that? He said we don't see a svara anywhere else, anywhere. That in other words, there was something that once upon a time people believed in spontaneous generation. Elamai. Pshat is, and we talked about this when we mentioned briefly the shiloh of the copper pods. So we explained that the copper pods are different. That you can actually see them, etc. But that when Rabbi Krakowski would address the shiloh of the copper pods, and people would say, "Is it mutter to drink water with living organisms in it?" So he'd say, of course, the shiloh has to be pumfaker. Is it mutter to drink water that doesn't have living organisms in it? And the answer to that is a vade, that it's usher, because if it doesn't have living organisms in it, so then it's toxic, right? And we spoke about it. You open up your mouth when you're not wearing a mask, right? And you breathe in dust mites, right? And you Yissachar breathe in germs, right? That's why we're all wearing masks. So we shouldn't exhale and we shouldn't inhale germs. But what are germs? A chaydak. It's a little tiny little bug. Microscopic as it may be, but it's a little tiny thing, right? And we're all familiar already with what the COVID-19 virus looks like, right? That little ball with the spikes on it, right? We're not sure if it's blue or red or whatever other color anymore because different products put it on in different colors, right? But the pshat is, right, we know more or less what it even looks like. And so it's something which with enough magnification can be seen. But nobody walks around thinking about the fact that when they're not wearing a mask, or maybe even when they're wearing a mask, some other stuff do get in or whatever it is, right? But nobody goes around thinking that when they breathe in, they're breathing in all sorts of living organisms. But the emes is sitaka azai. So Mamela, when something is totally microscopic, where there's no way to see it bichlal with the naked eye. So the pshat is, and again, you would see it if it's a lot, just like dust mites. You don't see every tiny little dust mite every time you inhale or exhale. However, if somebody takes a mattress, right, or a pillow or a chveisvos, right, that was sitting a long time in an attic, in a basement, in a machsan, right, and they give a geschmack klap to it, so then all of a sudden a cloud of dust comes out. And that cloud of dust is gepackt with dust mites. And then all of a sudden you see it because the dust mites form a whole entire cloud. So you can mamish understand that it's taka there, even though it's microscopic, because if there's enough of them together, they become ice microscopic. So the pshat is like this, about to go on time. No, it's not a pasha, because hilchatit, halachadik, we're not nisyaches bichlal, kol ikr, to something which is microscopic. If you can't see it, halachically, it's not there. Mamela, right, then you have the Malbim's whole approach to Tuma and Tyra and also and all sorts of things like that. He says batzim, it's germs. But the pshat is it's not there if you can't see it. We don't have a yachas hilchati to something which you can't see. Mamela, Rabbi Krakowski tells me minoi gavle means that it burrowed in, it came in, whether it's the eggs that were laid or whether it was something like that. It was at a microscopic stage. And Mamela, you can't. Mamela, that's what minoi gavle means. Minoi gavle means is that it never had a halachic status of being aser until after it was there, and it developed in the flesh, in this medium. It developed into something which now lu yehei, it would be in a different atmosphere. Then it would have a din of being maybe sharitz al adama or sharitz b'mayim v'chulei. But a yois that it's not b'mayim and it's not ba'adama. Mamelo kum tachais that it's mutter, and that's what minoi gavle means. That's the definition of this, so to speak, rabbinic spontaneous generation. It's not really spontaneous. There was something microscopic that was there. It's not yesh me'ayin. It's yesh from epis. Mamelo, that's a definition. So that takes care.
Germs don't come from eggs, and viruses also.
They don't need to come from eggs. It can be a being on its own. But it's
virus is a being.
So the difference between a virus, and a bacteria, is exactly that. A bacteria is actually a microscopic bug. A virus doesn't have life in of its own, but again, halachically, if it was visible, I don't know what it would have a din of a parasite, so to speak. It can't live on its own. It needs a host body to be able to live. That's why a virus will die much quicker than bacteria. That's the whole thing, that the surface, if you leave it long enough, even if there's somebody with corona came and coughed all over the table, after a certain amount of time, to shail exactly how long it can survive without having some sort of other DNA to chap onto. But at some point it will die because it needs something it needs to live off of a host. Whereas a bacteria is a living organism in its own right. Like every other living organism, it also needs food. So if you starve it from any type of food, it won't be able to live either. But in theory, if various things can come around, it doesn't need DNA, it doesn't need a host, it doesn't need a person or an animal or something like that. It can live off of all sorts of other things in the air that would give it its nourishment. So in other words, a bacteria can live without being in a host for extended periods of time.
The same thing like a bug, like
bacteria is mamish like a bug. Bacteria, it's a microscopic, but it's mamish like a bug.
If you could see it, it'll be like a virus.
Yeah, in theory, yeah. If it would be something that was, if you'd have like not microbacteria, but you'd have a macrobacteria, right? You'd have something which is a macrobacteria, something which is huge, right? Some sort of bacteria that would be bigger. You'd give it a din of a bug. Correct.
I'll ask you a practical question about salmon. So when you buy salmon, there's hashgachas on it.
Depends which hashgacha. Depends which hashgacha, and some say that they're makbid, they're not necessarily makbid. But let me get back to
how can you be makbid then? You can't eat the fish then.
Oh, so let's get back to a second. Let me just finish the stadim, the halacha that gets stadim, and then we'll talk about practical. So the word is like this. So the other tzad though, that mehecha tesi, once you found them in the cavity, so that Rabbi Krakowski was a little bit more nachas to be able to entertain. As you tell me now, you're finding it in other places. So he was mefapel and different rishonim if we're chayshish by just finding it in the cavity, or if you have to find the tafka in the beis harei or the peh, that you have to, or the iznaim, that you have to find through an entrance way. Because if it's an entrance way, then it's regayim adav that it came from outside. Whereas if it's in the stomach, mechatesi came from the outside, it could just as easily come from the flesh into the stomach. So that he was mistapik about. But he said some of the Rishayim and Achronim is a lashon of einanu bekiyim, if a particular worm is the worm that Chazal talking about in the Gemara or not. So he felt that it was kedai to have it checked out. So they actually had, the OU had the Museum of Natural History do a research project on it, and they actually came out with two interesting findings. So they did it also from a historical perspective and from a scientific perspective. From a scientific perspective, they found that when they watched the whole life cycle of the Anisakis, they found that it actually did sometimes burrow into the stomach. They never found that there were ones in the stomach that burrowed into the flesh. Beis is they also found that these are worms that were around Bisman Chazal, in particular in fish that were native to the Mediterranean, etc. And that there was Svirut Gdola, that these are the darni, these are the worms that the Gemara is talking about. Now, so Rabbi Krakowski felt that was mamish sufficient to be able to rule out any chashash otherwise between both of their findings and the fact that he thought that there's no reglayim ladavar to assume that it came from outside. And aside from their findings beforehand, he didn't feel it was reglayim ladavar to assume that it came from the outside. Elamai l'chayra, since we find them in the flesh, and sometimes they found also in the stomach or the egg cavity. So then there's virut that it came from the flesh into there, and that there's reglayim ladavar for. But he felt there wasn't reglayim ladavar for saying that it comes from the outside. Mitzad Sheni, now he also has a rayo that l'chayro they were around Bisman Chazal, and it's very like this is what they're talking about. Plus, we know that their life cycle is to migrate from the flesh sometimes into the stomach. However, they never found in their research any other evidence otherwise. Mela Rabbi Krakowski felt chad mashmait that it's mutter without even the piskei din from Moshe and the Rosh Zalman v'chulei. Now, even some of those who signed letters to us, or some of the Gdei HaPaisim that were on the letters, it's quite clear that the letter was probably altered a little bit after it was signed, and the lashon became much darker. That originally, they said that if there's taka safek, you should be chayshish. It was because the way the Metzius was presented to them, they didn't hear that there was a tzad that they didn't hear that there was any developments that is pretty clear otherwise. They said machmas a safek, it's kedai lahachmir. But now. we'll take it to the next level. I actually asked Rabbi Belsky Zechariah Levracha. I said, "What's geist der Han Rebbe? What does it bother you that the other wants to be more machmer?" It wasn't zayin. That's because he was very passionate about this argument. So I said, well, "Why does it bother Rebbe that the other wants to be more machmer?" So we said you have from mentioned people have all sorts of chumras. So this could be another chumrah. Somebody asks you, "Do you have to be machmer?" You say, "No, you don't think you have to be machmer, but why should we fight it as a chumrah?" So he told me that Lamaisa, he's worried because he says that there's more than just the Anisakis, that there are other similar types of things that they haven't discovered yet. And he said, he said it's going to come that you ba'at some kimat aser fish entirely. And he said it's a tremendous change of Messiah Sapsak, and it's a tremendous change to the Messiah, and it will be a tremendous change to the Shabbos table v'chulei. And he doesn't think that it's kedai to get into an area that leaves little or no return afterwards. Therefore, he felt very fervently that it should be that it should be argued out. Now, I'll tell you, B'didi Avi Ovda with the Oyu in Eretz Yisrael. I give us somewhat of a well-known place.
The problem of the Messiah of the Psak.
Yeah, he didn't want to change the Messiah of the Psak, and he fought it for that reason. Now,
you can't do that. Also,
yeah.
you're going to tell people you can't eat fish. I mean,
somebody asked.
That are also?
What?
There is worms that will be also according to.
There could be worms that are asur. Of course, and we have them. We know that we have in carp that there's bloodworms and they're regular prostate bloodworms that you have everywhere else. We know that they're coming through the ear flaps and they infest the brain. That's why they infest the brain, dafka, because they're coming from the ear flaps. So certain things are very clear, right? That's why very often the carp will be clean, but you have to cut off the head. It's much more negeh for a little Rosh Hashanah when you take if somebody takes a Reish Hadag and they take a carp's head to make sure that the carp's head is clean, because very often just the head will be infested and the rest of the fish will be entirely clean.
You can make sure yourself that it's clean?
You can buy it with hashgacha. Sometimes some stores will have hashgachas on it, or you can, depends where you get it from. If you go to the shukta place, it's not mushkach for these types of things. And then in the chanami, you'd have to check it. If you buy it in a store that has a geshmaka hashgacha on it, so you don't have to. So one second, just finish just a tiny bit more. So the vart was like this: is that. So this is Ma'aser Shaya Kachai B'didi Avi Ovda, that working for the OU, somebody called me up, a paisik who was very friendly with the OU, called me up and he said that would it be shy for the OU to be machmer, even though Rabbi Krakowski was mekel, etc., but for the OU to be machmer in the restaurants here or not to use fish with Anisakis. So I told him, I said, it's not fully up to me, this policy, I got out of it politically. But I mentioned this Ma'aser a few days later, mamish, maybe a week later, to Rabbi Berkowitz. And Rabbi Berkowitz told me, I hope you told him no, that you can't do it. So I was a little bit taken aback, because I don't know if any of you are familiar with him firsthand. Rabbi Berkowitz is one of the sweetest people I've ever met in my entire life. And putting aside his godless in psak and on Hagan and training many out of town rabbanim and kiruv rabbanim, etc., and being a rav of Choshev Kehillah in Sanhedrin Mechaber, all those other things aside, he's naitif ava, he's naitif mesikos, he's an extremely sweet person. So it was, I don't know if it was the only time, but it was certainly a very rare moment where I saw him get passionately annoyed about something. And so he also felt very strongly that. So I know there are many other poskim that I read Piskei Din from him that also felt that there's no reason to be machmir, and that for carrot we should uphold the Messiah, that it's mutter, etc. But here it was another side from Rabbi Belsky. I had that I got to hear how passionate Rabbi Berkowitz was that it's taka mutter and that you shouldn't do anything to even suggest that there's a chumrah not to eat them. Tachlis, some of the Israeli hashgachas decided that there would be makbid or makbid to a certain extent. I think the Eidach Haredis isn't makbid in products. They'll continue to certify products that have issues with Anisakis, so to speak, like herring, etc. But on their stores, when they sell fresh fish, so they sell it with loch shash or fakert. Maybe the products, I don't remember, they had like some sort of compromise. And they have signs up that tell you what has a chash, what doesn't have a chash, etc. Reuben claims to be makbid on the Anisakis. So there are some hashgachas that
How do you?
Again, because salmon from some regions doesn't have, and so a herring pretty much you can't certify. Sardines and mackerel you pretty much can't certify.
Okay.
There are some salmon. So if you get freshwater salmon, there's the farm grown salmon, and I think Norwegian salmon doesn't have a problem. I think Alaskan does, or vice versa. I don't remember exactly. To me, it's not again because I eat it all, and Rabbi Krakowski used to be medayik in this Gemara with the Maisa that Ravina said le'imei that she should make for him fish with these worms inside, and he's going to eat it. He said, why did he have to tell her to make the fish with the worms inside and he's going to eat it? He said, Mistama, they were ma'arid him even back then. He said, otherwise, why do you have to tell me this whole story that he said, the one with the worms inside, make it for me and I'm going to eat it? So he said, Elamai. L'chayro, there was, for the English amongst us, Rav Padova wrote a tshuva also, a very passionate tshuva, lahatir. Rabbi Kuber wrote a very long tshuva where he mamish took apart each and every one of them, more minor tinus even of the machmirim, so to speak. So there are many rabbanim chashuvim from some of the rabbanim who best understand the scientific side of it as well, that were definitely matir. Okay, now sorry about all the shilas. I certainly think it's totally fine, but for me, Belski was, that's
so
a quote.
When they have a Hechsher on salmon, what are they certifying?
No, so there's all sorts of other things that you can be certifying in the salmon, but in Achanami, salmon doesn't necessarily mean
It doesn't
Ashkach.
have to have nivdak on or anything.
No. And some of the Ashkach that say Nivdak aren't makbid themselves on these types of things. They may be checking for other types of insects, but it's again, salmon doesn't have so many other infestations other than this.
So it's okay to just buy fish.
Yeah, Rebelski felt that if somebody wants to be machmer on what's in the gut, it's kedai to clean it out. Well, just because there you can say be'etzim anduz. I have a little bit of a shiloh now that it's in the gut. If it swam out, swam in, etc. But he didn't. He felt that ikar didn't. That should also be fine. But that there might be a svar lahachmer on what's actually in the gut. But if it's properly cleaned out and washed, there shouldn't be any issue with that either.
You can go to in America to a store and buy salmon with
yeah.
and
So when you buy, if you're buying a whole fish, is absolutely no problem. The shaila is if you're buying a cut piece of fish that they might be selling dogim tameim, and the knife, which might then you get into issues of duchka the sakina v'chulei might have issues. So what they always say is that if you're in such a scenario for whatever reason you're buying kosher fish in a non-kosher fish store, so you should ask them to use a clean board for you. Possibly if they can put down a new piece of paper, so if they have paper that they're cutting on top of or something like that, they should put down a brand new piece of paper to cut your fish on top of. They should use a clean knife, and then afterwards, depending on the exact scenario, because it's cold and it's there's no davar charif, etc., it could be that it's sufficient with just washing it down. If you want to be machmer, you can mamish clean it well before you use it.
If it's already cut.
Yeah.
So okay.
You should have them use a clean knife and a clean cutting board, and or a brand new piece of paper, and then it's fine. If it's something that Rabbi Balski Grada held and many others hold that way, that salmon has a simon movik from its color. So even though they can inject color nowadays and things like that, if you inject pigment into another fish, it's not going to come out mamish the right color. So if somebody feels sufficiently comfortable with being able to identify salmon with the color, they might not actually need simonim of fins and scales, but
if they cut it before you come there, it's also okay, or they need to cut it with the paper and everything. Do you need to cut a full fish, not a cut fish?
Oh no! If they already cut it, so
it's nothing you can do.
Yeah, again, it might be so, but the worst case scenario would be k'dei klipo. You have to cut off a little bit from the edge or something like that yourself. And that would be the worst case scenario. Usually just washing it down would be enough, depending on all the particulars.
Just here, let's try. You went to the supermarket and there are all kinds of frozen fish. You can buy it, no problem.
I'll explain to you like this. First of all, if it doesn't have fins and scales on it, as you're buying fish that's already filleted and without any skin on, etc. So in theory, it needs simonim. So if it has a ashkacha, and it's chaysim techaysim with the ashkacha. If it's a shvacha ashkacha that might have gone into a plant in China and put on their ashkacha on anything there without having anybody present, so that leaves plenty of room to be mistopic. I mean, I think there's certain ashgacha. Again, a good ashgacha is a good ashgacha. A bad ashgacha is not a good ashgacha.
But like salmon, you see salmon, you have the skin.
Yeah, so and even if it doesn't have the skin because of the color, that's enough to identify. But if you're buying, you're buying, whether it's Yissachar, or whether it's a Nile perch, or whether it's mushed, what do they call it in English, sea bass, or whether it's some sort of whitefish or whatever it is that just fillet, right? So then without any skin on it, so then it should have a decent hashgacha. The other thing possibly could be, especially Pesach time, is that sometimes they'll put in, if it's not 100% fish, but some sort of additive to it, whether they just write it in water or they write whatever it is. They, especially with the Nile perch, they inject it in things because they fish it and it stays in the sun for a long time in order to keep it fresh and from spoiling. So they do inject other chemicals into it. So especially for Pesach, it's kedai that it has a good hashgacha in it. But it has nothing to do with Toilon. With herring, I wanted to be maisif one more nakuda, which could be also for other fish. There's a shaila, I think we discussed it when we talked about in dry fruit, the telam in dry fruit. How do you, in what type of volume, having bugs in what type of volume would create a mir tamotzi? So he talked about some sefer has this tshuva where he wrote that where the meicher perisivation in Pressburg, right, apropos for yeshiva, right, but that the meicher in Pressburg didn't want to sell dried fruit for Tu B'Shvat because he said there's no such thing as a barrel of dried fruit that doesn't have a telas. And he said you'd be correct if everybody was consuming a barrel, but that's not the normal way of consumption. So it would go in a handful, in a little bag, or whatever it is, a portion. And mainly in a portion, you don't have a mir tamatzli. So that's another shiloh, which is even a fish, which even if you'd be machmer on the Anisakis, it could be that in something like herring. So it might not be a barrier anymore once it's been pickled for a considerable amount of time in like a strong tzir, or if it was heavily cooked, as you make like a Moroccan style fish, right? Hassan, if you make a nice Moroccan style fish that was cooked in a good spicy kharena, what do they call it, kharena, whatever it's called, right? In a nice spicy sauce, and it's cooked for a long time, etc. So again, that might melt, that might break up whatever teilon would be there, even if you'd be makbid on it. Additionally, in each piece, certainly in something like herring, where it's eaten as little pieces, it's already cut up into little pieces. You don't have a miyat hamotzi, you have a barrier shlemo in any of those one pieces, especially if it's a smaller cut. As with sometimes you go into the supermarket, you buy the cheap herring, so it's these huge pieces that you can't get onto a cracker no matter how much you try. Right? You can't get it onto a cracker, onto lekach, no matter how much you try. Right, but when you buy like a geshmaka hamish herring, it comes lots of little small pieces. So when you eat such herring, which is lots of little small pieces, you don't have a miyat hamotzi of a barrier shlema on any of those. So that would be another tzad lahakel for anybody who is be'etzem machmer.
Who are the poskim
That Iser, it's not clear because again they put out a letter with a lot of signatures on it, but then some of them had their own shuvas where maybe they wrote at some point in time that was mutter before or after, and some of them maybe said who were asked by others afterwards said. That's why I was careful because it's hard for me to say who the Iser are because I don't know, and whatever I say, who signed the letter. They had people b'shaita about 10 years ago, so Rav Yashiv had signed it, and Rav Osner, but it's not clear that it seems like the letter was actually fully written up after Rav Yashiv signed, and a few words were added in. And Rav Osner maybe signed it already after the full nusach, but it's not clear because he has a tshuva in Shevet Levi. I think it says that it's mutter. So again, it's not. You have to understand exactly what he was told and what he was. It wasn't. There was a movement involved in it. So it's hard to know exactly what was going on there. I'll leave it by that. I'd rather not get into the details that might have been private too.
How come figs today, for example, people don't eat figs in Chazal?
No.
Chazal, everyone eats figs.
No. First of all, figs you can eat today. It's not that you can't eat figs today. Very often, the figs that you buy that are already on the shelf for quite some time are going to be infested. Aleph. Bases in fresh figs, they could be infested. It depends on the tree, depends on the care that was taken of it, etc. Thirdly, there might be ways around it, but there it's not. Again, you don't have a tzad of minoi gavle over there, because we know that fresh figs have infestation also, and if it's fresh figs have infestation, so it would be a sheretz al arts and malasot. Why it changes could be all sorts of different reasons. Climate changes, all sorts of different things. Secondly, it's in l'chayr, if you make, we have in writing actually that Rav Yashiv said that we can make jam out of figs, which it's already the G'dei Hachrayim say that once you're cooking it, if you take out any bugs that you see noticeably, easily, and then you cook the rest of it. So even though if you look carefully, you might find it's not called being mevatel isel chatchila. That was actually one of the things I discussed this morning in Shir in Avas Taruvas was being mevatel isel chatchila. So that's l'chayr not being mevatel isel chatchila for kam v'kam. Alf is I don't care to be mevatel. It's just that gurad is there, and now it's a matzah that I can't take it out. That's bikadol l'svar. But these things sometimes change a little bit, and it might be there's certain regions that might be more or less, seasons that might be more or less.
In America, it's less.
I don't know. I don't know. In America, I think figs also can have issues. Something has to be checked. But fresh figs, I found sometimes as if there was enough. My kids applied enough pressure to have figs on Tu B'Shvat or whatever it was. So there were times I found figs to be.
How do you check them?
To open them up, you have to check them.
It's noticeable. You can see.
You think you might be able to find a video of me checking them online if you have access to them. Anyway, type.
Everyone eats herring today. Nobody doesn't eat herring.
I've met people who don't eat herring. I think most people aren't makbid on this. Some people might think they're makbid on it, but they didn't really go through. They didn't really go through this again. They don't necessarily know the ramifications.
Yeah.
No, again, I want to explain to you. No, it's Rabbi Krakowski Zechariah Levracha used to very often say that when somebody is makbid on the chumrah just because they heard from somebody that maybe it's kedai lahachmir. So he felt like, if you do it temporarily till you're able to be mevar, because you heard from a good source, and maybe there's a reason to be machmir. There's a chaver who's epis amavin, but if you don't look into it, and just because somebody told you there's epis achomer, so it's a zilzon halacha, it means you don't care about dvar Hashem. So if you care about dvar Hashem, you're going to be mevar what the din is. So again, I think that there's a lot of people who think they might be makbid on a particular chomer, but they don't necessarily understand what the ramifications of it are, where it's negeh, what it's negeh on, v'chulei, and so they don't necessarily realize. So they one time heard about it when they were shopping for salmon, and they think they're being makbid and they only buy Reuben salmon. But l'maisa, when they go to a kiddush, like you said, or even maybe at home, they buy Eidach Haredis herring, and they never thought twice about it. Right? But, Beseder? No. Taif.